Well, hello again, friends. So we're continuing now in this sermon series on Moses. Started it last week, and for those of you who have been in this study, we started that 2 weeks ago, actually, and this was the third session of it this morning at the small group hour. But even if you weren't participating in the study, that's fine. I think we'll get you up to speed with what's going on. Last week we talked about the origins of baby Moses. Moses being put into the Nile River because the Pharaoh was concerned at the explosion of the Hebrew population and said, if I'm going to keep these people under my control, if I'm going to keep them in slavery, we're going to need to scale back on the population. So he gave an order that the boy babies would be killed and their bodies would be thrown into the Nile River. But one escaped based on the cleverness of his mother. Moses escaped and was actually raised by Pharaoh's daughter, who found him by the water's edge when she went down to bathe one day. And she brought him home, raised him up, and then he became a fugitive for a while because he struck and he killed one of the Egyptians while the Egyptian was beating one of the Hebrew men. And he then flees to this land called Midian. He ends up becoming a sheep herder, following in the footsteps of his father-in-law, gets married, has a family, and then he has to go back based on God's command or his appearing to him at the burning bush and said, it's time for you to go back now to where you came from, and you need to confront Pharaoh, tell him that the people need to be allowed to leave, and there's the plagues that follow because Pharaoh is not willing to do that. And then finally, there's the Passover event, and I know I'm going really fast, but it gets us to the point now where the Hebrew people have been freed from Pharaoh's grasp. They move into the Sinai desert where they are spending their time in the wilderness. And one day, Moses goes up on top of Mount Sinai about 50 days after they arrive. And he comes down the mountain and he has got these commandments that he is going to share with the people. And here is the story of God giving these commandments to Moses. So, starting in the 20th chapter. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents, to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation for those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid, and trembled, and stood at a distance, and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. If you have spent any time looking at Egyptian hieroglyphics, if you have received a piece of jewelry from somebody who has gone to Egypt as a tourist or a pilgrim and come back, If you have spent any time observing symbols of royalty and the pharaohs and those who are held in high esteem in Egyptian ancient culture, you are probably familiar with this little crest or this insignia, almost like a brooch, with a beetle in the middle of it. And that beetle is called the scarab. And some of you are familiar with this. The scarab was one of the most frequently used symbols in all of ancient Egypt for the value that it had. Another one was the symbol of the cobra. So by the time that we look at the lower kingdom of Egypt and we find what is on the headdress or in the official iconography among the pharaoh, you will usually see the cobra and oftentimes the scarab. Now, it's interesting that a creature that most of us would probably completely disregard, like a cockroach, and almost find gross or not want in our homes, the beetle, was something that would be so highly respected and revered that it would end up as an emblem of the pharaoh. And it's not just a beetle either. Now, my understanding is that there are over 40,000 different kinds of beetles, and it's not the beetle in general that the pharaoh was interested in, or the ancient Egyptians, but a particular kind of beetle, the most dignified of all the beetles in the beetle family, and that of course is the dung beetle. And the dung beetle is the scarab. And here's why. This is based in part on some understanding of the dung beetle and some misunderstanding of the dung beetle in ancient Egypt. But what the ancients in Egypt observed was that every morning when the sun would rise, the dung beetle would emerge from his or her hole in the ground. They would then go find, and this is the gross part, but they would go find some animal excrement, and then they would begin the process of perfecting a sphere of animal dung and rolling this ball in the direction of the sun all day long. And so they would move from east to west all day long, rolling their dung ball. And then at the end of the day, they would go back underground again, waiting to emerge in the next day. Now, the ancient Egyptians tracked this behavior of the dung beetle, and they said, well, this is a divine creature, because we worship the sun above all things. And the sun is what comes up each day in the east. It goes across its journey across the sky throughout the day, and in the west, it sets underground and emerges again the next day. And so for the ancient Egyptians, the sun practiced a life cycle, like a human life cycle, all day long. It's born in the morning, it goes throughout midlife and during midday, and then it sets again underground, only to go to the underworld to be regenerated and resurrected again with the new day. And so if you were looking for a creature, an animal, a critter, an insect that was emblematic of this kind of behavior, well, I guess that you'd say, gosh, the dung beetle seems like the perfect choice. And not only that, but the dung beetle rolls a sphere that looks like the sun, or maybe the earth. They didn't understand the earth was round, but they understood that this was a process that was this glowing orb in the sky was represented on the ground as well. And so the scarab, or the dung beetle, becomes one of the principal figures or symbols of ancient Egypt, and the god above all gods, Ra, or Re, sometimes it's printed. As Stephen talked about, for those of you who were in the class just before this, that's where we get Ramses, the son of Re, or the son of Ra, is as the God's son, the son of God, the son of the sun god, really, is sort of what we're talking about. And Ramses II may well have been the Pharaoh at the time of Moses going back into Egypt and telling that Pharaoh, Ramses II, to let his people go. And I give you this explanation about the scarab, the dung beetle, because I think it helps us understand a little bit better the mindset, the worldview, maybe just an understanding of how Egyptians approached the world. They wanted to make connections between the natural world and the cosmos, and they wanted to assign characters or figures to these different roles. And so there were gods for the dust. There were gods for the water. There were gods for the sky. There were gods for the sun. There were gods for the earth and the dirt and the soil and so forth. And so you get the idea. And so in this great pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses, we have backstories. And the stories are amazing. I mean, they're wild. We've got all of the stuff that you would find in a modern soap opera. It was Game of Thrones before there was Game of Thrones. There is hero worshiping. There are gods and goddesses. There is all kinds of promiscuous sex. There's incest. There's murder. There's backstabbing. There's lying. There's deceit. All this plays its way into these stories of how all of these Egyptian gods and goddesses relate to one another. And because Ramses and the pharaohs before him were seen as the living, breathing, human versions of gods on earth, it was in the best interest of the pharaoh to try to perpetuate the story and to keep it going, because the pharaoh had more control. And if everybody believed that their particular role was on earth just to serve God and just to produce and just to make more so that it would keep the whole machine going, well, this was to Pharaoh's advantage. And when you found times where the pharaohs would get into trouble, it's when they would get paranoid, because they felt like their grasp, their control was starting to slip away. And so we even see with Ramses' predecessor, his father, the one who was around when Moses was born, you start to see his paranoia slipping in, right? And we just talked about that, where he said, I see the Hebrew people, they are getting to be too big and too mighty, and if they want to overthrow us, they might be able to. And so in order to avoid some sort of a riot or insurrection, we're going to make sure that we do a little population control. And you see sort of what's going on in the mindset of the pharaoh. People are expendable, and anything that they can do to preserve power. And this is, of course, the story of megalomaniacs throughout human history, right? At some point when they feel threatened, they act in ways that are catastrophic, and atrocities are committed. And so that's a little bit of background on what's going on in the story. And then we have the plagues. And we didn't really talk about that last week in the sermon. We didn't get into that. We spent some time in our lesson with the small groups this morning talking about the plagues. And Adam Hamilton in his book points out what many scholars have pointed out now for decades and generations, really. And that is that we have this sneaking suspicion that the actual plagues, the plagues that God visits on the Egyptians because Pharaoh will not let the Israelites or the Hebrew people leave, those individual plagues seem to correspond to the various gods and goddesses in this Egyptian pantheon. So I have a slide that you're going to take a look at. So if you turn your attention to the screen, just by way of a couple of examples. We have one of the first plagues over on the far right. Hapi is the god of the Nile. And so the first plague is that Moses strikes the Nile River and the river turns blood red, and the water is no longer able to be used for irrigation. We can't use it for drinking, and all of the fish and the wildlife begin to die in the river. But interestingly enough, that strikes at one of the original goddesses, one of the gods of Egypt, who is the god of the Nile. Then we get into the locusts filling the sky and the dust coming up from the ground. And again, we have Hathor, the cow or the cattle god. And oftentimes in hieroglyphics, you'll see Hathor depicted as a woman, and you'll recognize her because she will have cow horns above her head. And even you see in the cow, in the horns, you see in the middle, the circle, there's the sun, because the sun god Ra trumps all the other gods. Then you have Heket, who is the goddess of fertility and birth, and she has a frog face. So she, again, is the plague of the frogs. So every time we have one of these plagues read about in the book of Exodus, it would correspond to one of the Egyptian gods. And then again, finally, the sun god, which is where the final plague ends up, or the second to the last plague, I should say, is where the sky turns black and the sun refuses to shine. And so there we have a demonstration of the God of Israel is saying, even your God, the God above all gods, Ra, the sun god, I will even black out the skies to show you that this God is a fake God, is an artificial God. And then I think it's interesting that the final plague really is the story of the Passover event, right? Where God says to Moses, tell the people to mark their doorposts with the blood of the lamb, and then the angel of death will pass over all of those houses, but on the Egyptian houses, the firstborn son will die. And then the Hebrew people go into the Reed Sea or the Red Sea or the Yam Suf, and they go through this passage which has been made dry land for them, and then the waters come and they take out the rest of Pharaoh's army. Now, even in that story, do you see how the story has come full circle yet again? Because remember how this whole thing started was when Ramses II's father said, all of the baby boys shall be put into the Nile. In other words, if they weren't dead already, they drowned to the bottom of the river. And now the waters come over all of Pharaoh's army again, and they are the ones who meet their watery grave. So it feels like all of these stories, especially in Exodus, there seems to be a lot of tit for tat. If this happens, then this will come to cover it or compensate for it. If this is the god or the goddess, then this will be the plague that corresponds to it. If this is the thing that Pharaoh's going to do, then God's going to do it, but do it one better. And what I've found is as I've been doing some research on this, is that I never was taught this, but I can't help but wonder if we have these stories of the 10 plagues and they bring chaos because all of the gods and the whole system and the economy begins to suffer, right? There's illness, there's crop failure, there's livestock that has been devastated, and everything goes into disarray. And all of the things that Pharaoh used to rule with an iron fist and to keep a grasp of control over the people is now in shambles. And so God then takes the Israelites into the wilderness, and he gives them then to correspond in maybe a counterpunch to the 10 plagues. There's now 10 commandments. It just seems to me that it wouldn't be a 10 and a 10 if that wasn't purposeful. Why 10 plagues? Did we need to have 10 plagues, or is it meant to counter the 10 commandments? And what are the 10 commandments except for rules? As Amy so beautifully just illustrated with the children, they're rules that help us bring order to the chaos. Because without those rules, without those commandments, everything is in disarray. Everything is out of control. Things spin beyond our ability, and we can't make sense of things, much like the plagues did when they upset the order of everything that was going on in ancient Egypt. And again, another thing that Stephen mentioned so beautifully, I think, in the class just now, is that remember that the Egyptians were all about what they could produce. Their value as people was about what they were able to offer to the gods, and in turn, wink, wink, to Pharaoh. And if you were not useful, then and producing, then the society had no place for you. And so when everybody's value and worth is called into question, when the economy collapses, when people are fighting for their life and their livelihood, everything is in disarray. But God says, let me show you a better way with these 10 commandments. Now, we've talked about the 10 commandments before. I've done a few sermons on this. But I think it's worth revisiting again. Because sometimes we talk about commandments and we talk about the law and we talk about rules as though they were something that was meant to be restrictive. That they were something that felt like a penalty to us, or that it was punitive in some way. But if you think about the actual commandments and you think about how they apply to your life, one, I think you will easily see that yes, this helps bring order out of chaos and anarchy. But I think you'll also begin to see that these rules are actually rules that aren't meant to limit us, but to liberate us. And as I've said before, the favorite illustration I keep going back to is it's like a fence around a playground for children. Now, the fence is not there to make the children feel like they are in a pen or that they are imprisoned within the walls and confined within this space, but instead it's meant to say, within this framework, you have freedom. You can play freely. As long as you abide by the boundary, everything is okay. Most everything is going to function just fine in there, and the children are able to play free, and they are not worried about being hit by traffic. They are not worried about the stray animal that may find its way in. They are not worried about what exists on the outside of the wall because they are free to be inside of those boundaries. And when we look at these boundaries, if we abide by them, to think about things like, I don't have to worry about my spouse's fidelity or my own. I don't have to worry about people killing people out of vengeance or because they want to take something that doesn't belong to them. I don't worry about stealing. On Father's Day, it's nice to think about honoring your parents and about how those who have given you life and have nurtured you are those worth caring for and preserving, especially as they enter into older age, right? We think about all of these things that when we look at the Ten Commandments, we start to pick them apart, well, it makes sense. And I don't think we would want to have a life apart from those commandments because it would mean that we would start to descend into chaos. It would mean that the social order of things, the fabric, would start to fall away, and we would forget about how to live in community. We would forget about what it is that we are called to be. And the difference between Pharaoh and God is that Pharaoh's system was about serving him and about his self-interests. But God's commandments seem to be less about actually us bowing down before God, and they seem to be more about how we can honor God by living in such a way that brings life, that brings joy, that allows us in community to flourish. And even though the first commandment is really about you shall have no other gods before me, it's really not about God needing idol worship. It's about us having our priorities straight. And as I've been thinking about this whole big picture, I've been thinking about how maybe the first commandment is actually the hardest one for us to follow. It may not seem that way at first glance, and maybe we're not always totally honest, and maybe we steal in a wink-wink kind of way at times, and maybe we haven't honored our parents, and maybe we haven't honored the Sabbath as we should. But I think the one that we really struggle with is the first commandment. Because as much as we would like to believe we are a highly evolved species, I think many of us continue to live our lives in the same way as the dung beetle. We get up, we do our thing, we go back down to slumber, and we repeat. And all day long, we work with the dung of what's been thrown at us. And we get real proud of our dung ball, don't we? I mean, we want ours to be bigger than the other person's. We want ours to be shinier than the other person's. We want our dung to be compacted into the perfect sphere. We even want to show people that we are more efficient at rolling our dung than other people. But how much of our days and how much of our lives are really about doing the things that matter most? If we look at the Ten Commandments as a roadmap for how we should live our lives, for where our priorities should be, for what we should spend our time and our resources on, are we spending those on the things that matter most? Are we spending them on family, loved one, worshiping God, honoring Sabbath, caring for creation, loving our neighbor, serving? Or are we really spending our time more about consuming, accumulating, growing, perfecting, and dung rolling? I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but how many times have we caught ourselves feeling like, for the last number of hours, the last number of days, maybe the last number of weeks, I've been going through the motions, and it's just been on a repetitive cycle, but I've never really stopped to say, is this order artificial? Who am I serving with this kind of agenda for my life? Or should I reevaluate? Should I go back to the roadmap? And should I try to live my life by the commandments that were originally given to Moses, who were passed down to the Hebrew people and the Israelites, and then became those who entered into the promised land and became our spiritual ancestors? And then we fast forward and we see that Jesus offers us a new way of living. And he's saying, I see the way that you are living your life, but you are now a slave to the rules instead of understanding about what's behind the rules. You become so consumed with the black and white of the law that truly I tell you, here is a different way to practice it. And this is the way that leads to light. This is the way that leads to life. This is the way that leads to the kind of creation that you are meant to be. The kind that loves God, the kind that honors yourself, the kind that serves your neighbor. And this is the kind of community we are bringing back. This is the kind of going back to the basics that I want you to be a part of. And when you build your church, and when you grow this mission and this ministry in my name, this movement that I am at the center of, I want it to be clear that this is about justice. This is about goodness. This is about holiness. This is not just about productivity. This is not just about honoring some God-man that you have created for yourself or an idol, but this is about going back to the basics of what it means to be what you were created to be. And the beauty of that is that Jesus reminds us through his life cycle of birth, life, death on the cross, resurrection again. It means that each day brings not the opportunity to repeat what we did the day before, but each day brings a new beginning. Each day we are born anew with the promise of resurrection, with the ability to set the dung of life aside and to focus on what really matters. And for us this day, maybe this is just a wake-up call. Maybe it's a going back to the map again. But maybe it's time that we just have a little bit of reordering of things again. So on this day of Sabbath, on this day of honoring your father and your mother, on this day of worship, and on this day of putting no gods before our God, the one, the true God, the one who gave his son so that we might be born each day with new life. Let us put that best foot forward. Live into that promise. And joyfully accept the gift that we have been given, that the love of God made known to us through Jesus Christ makes every day a new beginning. For our God creates all things new. Let's pray.